many thanks to all of you for being here this afternoon and for giving me the chance to talk about what I think is a very important issue, the investment bill and its possible negative ramifications for the economy, for the FDI we so badly need, and what I think we need to do as the way forward in order to avert the possible dangers. Just first of all, to note two things, that the name of the bill has changed. It used to be the Promotion and Protection of Investment Bill. They've decided to cut out promotion because clearly the bill wasn't going to do anything to promote investment. And the other thing that has changed, which one should acknowledge, is that in the first version of the investment bill brought out in 2013, there was a truly appalling clause included, which would have allowed the government to take property as custodian rather than expropriating it into its own ownership, and that would have meant no compensation would be payable at all. And we and others raised the alarm on that provision, and it's a very important advance that that particular provision has gone. But there are still many other concerning aspects of the bill. And I'd like to start with a bit of background, to talk in particular about the termination of European bilateral investment treaties, often known as BITs. And we entered into 13 European BITs soon after 1994. It was after the political transition, part of South Africa's reintegration into the global economy, but also seen as a necessary step in order to build confidence in the new government and help promote growth and development. But in 2007, the Department of Trade and Industry, the DTI, began reviewing these agreements, saying that they were very poorly drafted. And in 2009, at the end of this review, the DTI recommended that the BITs should be restructured and that new legislation should also be adopted. And this led in 2010 to a cabinet decision that the BITs needed to be renegotiated, plus again the need for new legislation. According to a lawyer at Weber Wenzel, Ben Winks, there actually has been some confusion about what the cabinet endorsed. He believes very strongly that it was only renegotiation that was authorized, and instead we've had termination. All the European BITs have been ended. There's the full list from Belgium, Luxembourg, through Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, etc., to the UK, all the way down to Finland and Sweden. And at the same time, our BITs with China, Russia, Cuba, the Czech Republic, and Iran, and 3 other countries have remained. And the DTI has been saying recently that it didn't really terminate these BITs. They just lapsed by the effluxion of time. And again, that does not seem to be accurate, because what needed to be done was for South Africa to send a notice of termination to the state in question, and that's actually what it did. And it did this progressively from about October 2, 2012 onwards. And it was all done very quietly and behind the scenes. I, for example, didn't even know that all 13 agreements had been cancelled. The media have spoken of 6. There was no parliamentary debate on the terminations. There was very little press coverage. And the termination of the South Africa United Kingdom BIT, I learnt about from Weber Wenzel, a legal firm. They said it was quietly terminated in August 2013, and it had a 12-month expiry period, so it came to an end in August last year. Now, I follow the press pretty carefully. I knew nothing about it. How many other South Africans really knew nothing about the fact that this extremely important agreement had been terminated, even though the UK is one of our most important investors, if not the most important, because its direct and indirect investments from the UK, the value of them cumulatively stands at about 1,650 billion rand. So this was, you'd think, a matter for public debate and some agreement on whether it was the right thing to do. By contrast, the value of direct and indirect investment from China at that time stood at about 75 billion rand. And yet what seems to be happening is that the ANC government is turning its back against the West, playing up the relationship with Russia and China, whereas it would seem that the more sensible approach for a country like this would be to try and have friendly relations with everyone. Comments on the bill by the EU business chamber are, first of all, that there are 2,000 EU companies in South Africa which have created 300,000 direct jobs and about 150,000 indirect ones, which is a significant contribution to the economy. That these EU investors are also here for the long haul, that they do a great deal to contribute to South Africa, not only through the jobs, but by also training, skills development, the transfer of technology, participation in Black economic empowerment initiatives, and so on. And according to this chamber, the termination of the BITs, and I quote, sent a very negative message to the EU business community. And the practical result is that many new investments by potential EU investors are now on hold. They want to see what gets put into the bill. They want to look at the overall investment climate in South Africa, and they're beginning to pay much more attention to countries elsewhere on the African continent, which seem to be more investor-friendly. Comments by US business, very much drawn from a submission by the American Chamber of Business in South Africa, or AmCham, to Parliament, saying in essence that the US doesn't have a bilateral investment treaty with South Africa, but it has drawn comfort from the fact that we had all these European BITs, because those BITs would to some extent constrain the policy choices the government might make. So Rob Davies often says it doesn't matter whether you have the BITs or not. Investors, countries like the US don't have one and they still invest here. Well, I think this helps explain why the US invests here, or has done so in the past, partly because of the sense that the European BITs provide everybody with some reassurance. Direct and indirect investment from the US totals close on 11 billion rand, and there are about 600 US companies in South Africa, of whom 89 were surveyed by AmCham in the course of drawing up this parliamentary submission. Those particular companies employ more than 220,000 South Africans, and again, they make a substantial contribution to the country beyond those jobs. But according to AmCham, the bill does not adequately protect investor rights. And there is a real concern again that American companies could either begin to divest from South Africa if this bill goes through, together with other damaging possible changes to property rights, and at the very least it is making potential investors from the US think more carefully about whether they want to come here or not. At the same time, there is the SADC Protocol. This is a protocol on finance and investment which was concluded in 2006. And it's an agreement between all the different SADC countries, of which, of course, South Africa is also part. It was ratified by South Africa's parliament in 2008, and it entered into force in April 2010, which means that the protocol is legally binding in South Africa. And it's also part of a wider SADC initiative to try and promote direct investment in the region as a whole. And SADC recognizes that if that is to happen, then SADC member countries must have much clearer rules. They must do more to create a conducive environment for investment, and rules should be harmonized across the region so that the benefits are spread throughout it. And there's some very important clauses in the SADC Protocol, that South Africa must create favorable conditions for investments and a predictable climate, always very important to an investor before committing resources to a country. And then critically, that investments may not be nationalized or expropriated except for a public purpose, such as the building of a road, and against full market value compensation. In addition, investors have the right to international arbitration, and this must be on an investor-state basis, but after the exhaustion of local remedies. In other words, the investor company which is aggrieved by the government's action can go to international arbitration, does not have to rely on his or her host state being willing to take up the cause. There is, as it were, a direct cause of action in the hands of the investor. Other key aspects of it, that the definition of expropriation clearly includes indirect expropriation. This is where the state itself does not acquire ownership, but the regulations that it enacts result in the former owner or current owner losing many of the benefits of ownership and the powers of ownership. And that could happen, for example, a very topical illustration, which I'll come back to, with the Private Security Industry Regulation Amendments, or SIRA, which say that for foreign security companies operating in South Africa, there must be 51% South African ownership. Now, the state will not own the shares that have to be transferred, but those companies, once they've lost 51%, will no longer have all the benefits of ownership or the powers of ownership that they used to have. So that amounts to an indirect expropriation, which under the SADC Treaty counts as an expropriation for which full market value compensation is payable. And this payment of market value for both direct and indirect expropriation is a key part of international best practice. It's very different from what the investment bill provides. And just to highlight some of the differences, there's no clear protection in our bill against either expropriation or nationalization. Instead, investors are told that they have the protection of Section 25 of the Constitution. This, of course, is the property clause, and it says that investors are entitled on expropriation to just and equitable compensation, and various criteria have to be met in order for an expropriation to be valid. But the government seems to be riding rather roughshod over Section 25. Through the expropriation bill, which is currently before Parliament, for example, it seems to be willing to sanction a measure which may not entirely negate the constitutional protections anymore, but will make it very difficult for people to rely on them. In addition, Section 25 does not cover indirect expropriation, so immediately there's a big gap in the protection that it provides. And secondly, it makes market value one of 5 factors that must be considered that are relevant to compensation. In essence, it talks also about what are commonly known as discount factors, the history of the acquisition of the property, the purpose of the expropriation, the current use of the property. These are all things which are extremely difficult to quantify in monetary terms, so there's very little certainty as to how much value will be attributed to something like the current use of the property. How much will that take off market value? The purpose of the expropriation, how much will that take off market value? Nobody really knows, which is one of the great problems with relying on Section 25 of the Constitution. And in addition, the bill allows only state-to-state arbitration, and then only after the exhaustion of domestic remedies, and then only with our government's consent, which means that this is really a meaningless right. If your so-called right to go to arbitration depends on the state agreeing, it isn't a right at all. At best, you have a hope that the state will agree. There's also the point that under customary international law, states have always had the power to act on their nationals' behalf against other states who in some way harm their nationals. So to say we'll allow state-to-state arbitration is really nothing particularly important. Now, the DTI rejects ISDS, and let me explain what that is. It's opposed to investor-state dispute resolution. In other words, where an investor who is aggrieved doesn't have to go back to his home state and say, please will you bring arbitration on my behalf. The investor himself can go to an appropriate arbitral forum and seek relief. And the DTI claims that whenever this kind of clause is in existence, you get arbitration proceedings being launched which are unfair to states, which limit their regulatory powers, and where inevitably the arbitration decision is in favor of the investor, and that this is something which a sovereign state can't really tolerate. But this is not really accurate, because if you look at UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, their investment report for 2015, it looks at the kinds of arbitration cases that have been brought under BITs over the years. And there are more than 3,000 BITs altogether, and of course hundreds of thousands of investors who are covered by them. And yet there have been only 405 cases, of which 144 or 36% were in fact decided in favor of the state rather than the investor. And there were 111 or 27% which were decided in favor of the investor, and the balance were either settled or withdrawn. So what the DTI claims then it doesn't really fit with the facts. In addition, and I think this is probably the key concern, the DTI says that this kind of dispute settlement option limits the radical transformation that the ruling party plans for South Africa. Now, whether radical transformation will be good for the country, whether it will really bring prosperity to all South Africans, or whether it will instead harm the country and make the poor even poorer, is another debate. But that's what it wants to be able to do. However, we have all these bilateral investment treaties entered into after 1994, and yet there have been only 2 cases where a matter was brought to arbitration. One concerned a Swiss investor whose game farm was targeted for land reform, and the second was the Graniti case, which I think was what the government felt particularly strongly about. The Graniti case arose under the provisions of the MPRDA, the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act of 2002, which came into force in 2004, and under which all mineral resources in the country became vested in the state as custodian. And about 2/3 of those mineral resources had been privately owned under common law rules, essentially. Graniti argued, or the investors who owned this particular company argued, that this amounted to an expropriation, and they sought arbitration under an Italian BIT and also the one with Belgium, Luxembourg, saying they should be awarded compensation. And in the end, they weren't awarded compensation. The case was settled, but instead of having to provide a 26% BEE stake, as the mining charter provides, they were asked instead to provide a 5% BEE stake, and were told that whatever they could do by way of local beneficiation, the value of that could be set off against the BEE stake, which they were expected to implement. So it was an agreement that didn't entirely go the investors' way, but it certainly also didn't entirely go the government's way. And it was probably this more than anything else that prompted the decision to start exiting from the bilateral investment treaties. And people might say, well, isn't that a good thing? Because we need to have laws like the MPRDA. But if you look at what happened to our mining sector after the MPRDA was brought into force, there really is a question as to whether it has worked well for South Africa. The mining sector is in deep trouble. In the middle of the global commodities boom, our mining sector shrank by 1% a year, whereas everybody else in the world was able to take advantage of that boom and see their mining sectors grow by 5% a year on average. And the critical factor is the uncertainty which the Act has generated in the minds of investors, very vague provisions, very arbitrarily enforced, which has given South Africa a bad reputation in the minds of investors around the world, and has seen mining jobs lost, mining investment reduced, and there really is a question whether this has been a good form of redress for the country. By contrast, Botswana, which adopted a mining law based on international best practice, has seen its rankings rise on the Fraser Institute, has seen much more investment going in, and arguably has done much better from that kind of law, which would not have been in conflict with a BIT. Another point is that all public power is already subject to judicial review by domestic investors in South Africa. When we decided to abandon the system of parliamentary sovereignty which applied in the apartheid era, and to say that all legislative and executive power would be subject to judicial review to make sure that it complies with the Constitution, we did, of course, give all South Africans, individuals and companies, the possibility of challenging government policy before the courts for failure to comply with the Constitution. But again, there has been very little action of that kind, and there are various laws that could have been challenged, the MPRDA itself, things like the Employment Equity Act as well. And the other point is that South Africa has agreed to investor-state dispute resolution in the SADC Protocol, and so it's bound by that. Now the DTI is beginning to say that it doesn't really matter about the SADC Protocol, that it's going to be reviewed, that changes are being discussed with the Committee of Ministers, but in fact the protocol's current terms stand, and they can only be changed with the consent of 3/4 of SADC members. And it apparently took about 4 years to get all the SADC members to agree to the terms of the protocol as it now is. So will it take 4 years or possibly longer before agreement can be reached to change the terms of the SADC protocol? And in the meantime, it's simply inaccurate for the DTI to say it doesn't matter that the SADC protocol says something different. And the investment bill is flawed in other ways too. Just to give a couple of examples, the period for public consultation was extraordinarily short. The bill was tabled in late July. You had to put your comments in August. The parliamentary hearings took place in September. The whole thing felt like a rushed process. And yet we know from the Constitutional Court that it's very important that there should be adequate public consultation on new legislation. Many provisions, to my mind, are too vague to be constitutional. Adherence to the rule of law is one of the founding values that our Constitution sets out and makes it clear that we must always uphold. And it's vital, a central tenet of the rule of law, that rules must be certain and predictable. People must know what is allowed and what is not allowed. They must be able to plan their actions and to comply with laws that are clear and certain. And they must know what their rights will be. Whereas the bill says something like this, that compensation, it hints, the wording again is not clear, may also depend on the state's available resources and capacity, which I would think is a very worrying provision for most investors. You've got Section 25, market value, and the discount factors are all very uncertain, and now you've got this extra provision as well, which means you really can't tell what compensation you might get. The right to repatriate the capital that you've invested and the returns on it is rather poorly defined. The bill talks simply of funds, and it doesn't explain just what might be included in those funds. And critically, it says that the right to send them back to their home state will depend on taxation and other applicable legislation, which is extraordinarily broad and vague again. And the upshot of what the DTI has been doing is that we will soon have 4 different investment regimes. First of all, under the survival clauses in the terminated BITs, for example, the one with the United Kingdom, which ended in August 2014, has a 20-year survival clause. In other words, any investment that was made before the termination of the BIT will still be protected by the same terms for a period of 20 years. It's only fresh investments made after the termination of the BIT that don't have protection. So the government might be hoping to have freedom of action to do whatever it might want to do on the policy front, but actually where investments have been made by European investors during the period of the currency of their BITs, they still have protection, generally for 20 years, sometimes a bit less. Under the remaining BITs with China and Russia and Cuba, I tried to look at the Russian one, but it was in Russian, so I couldn't get very far. On the China one, it's a standard bilateral investment treaty, which entitles investors from China to fair and equitable treatment, which says that if there's expropriation, direct or indirect, they must get at least market value just before the expropriation was announced, and so on. So those BITs at the moment continue. And so they're a different system yet again for some investors. Then, of course, there's the investment regime which applies under the SADC Protocol, which interestingly does not apply only to other SADC members. So you can be an investor from the UK or from Italy, and you can have the benefit of the SADC Protocol for an investment that was entered into after August 2010, which was when the SADC Protocol came into force. And that, as we've seen, has the standard provisions that BITs normally give. And then there's going to be the bill, which gives a very attenuated, limited form of protection to investors, particularly if it's adopted in its current form. And yet UNCTAD has really warned against uncertainty in investment rules, and particularly against piecemeal changes to investment rules, has said that this is something which states should not engage in. So these are all the sort of legal, constitutional issues, and I want to turn now to focus on something else, which is the importance of growth and jobs. Because when Parliament is asked to adopt legislation, it has a twofold obligation. First of all, to make sure that South Africa is not going to be in breach of any binding legal provision on it, and secondly, to make sure that the laws that it adopts are sensible for the country, that they will help to promote prosperity, that they will help to get everyone that better life for all that was promised way back in 1994. But we know, and we can see it now, particularly from 21 years of experience, that a focus on redistribution is not enough to meet the needs of a growing population. It's trite, it's simple, but it is true. Simply dividing up the existing cake in different ways is not enough. You have to grow the cake as well. And the population has gone up very rapidly. It was about 40 million in 1995. It's 55 million in 2015, which is a very rapid increase, and it's growing now at almost 1 million a year. So despite the fact that the economy has in fact generated more jobs, what we've seen is that the number of people who are unemployed has gone up very sharply since 1994. 3.7 million people who were unemployed in 1994. This is on the expanded definition, which I think is more accurate. In other words, it takes account of people who are not actively looking for jobs anymore because they haven't got money for transport or they're too discouraged in other ways, but they do still want to work. And from that figure, we have now risen to 8.4 million in 2015, which is, of course, more than 100% increase. And if we're going to generate more jobs, we must get our growth rate up to at least 5% of GDP, if not 7% of GDP. And yet the average growth rate since 2009 has been 1.8%, I beg your pardon, of GDP, which is clearly just not enough to generate those jobs. We know that the growth rate in 2014 was 1.5% of GDP. It's probably zero so far this year. We had a bit of growth in the first quarter. It seemed to be reversed in the second quarter. We're waiting to see what happens in the third quarter, but it was unlikely to be a dramatically good story. And this figure is important too, that the growth rate per person was 0.1% of GDP in 2014. And that's down from 1.1% in 1994. So in 1994, when we were coming out of apartheid and out of a decade of people's war with extraordinary political violence and turbulence and huge uncertainty about the direction of the country, we were still able to notch up 1.1%, pretty poor, but much better than what we have now, 0.1% of GDP on a per capita basis. And GDP per person has in fact shrunk in the past. It's very sad to think that in 1981, in 2010 figures, the average GDP per capita was round about 51,000 rand. And then, because of apartheid, because of the People's War, it went down and down and down, and finally bottomed out and started to rise again. But it took us until 2006, that's 25 years or a quarter of a century, to get back to GDP per capita of around 51,000 rand. So it seems really sad that we couldn't grow from 51,000 up, that we went through this major dip. And there is, of course, a risk that we may go through a dip again, particularly if our economic growth rate remains below the population growth rate. So we need investment for growth. The National Development Plan urges that we should put 30% of GDP into fixed investment on economic infrastructure like schools and clinics, and economic infrastructure such as Eskom and the ports and harbours, and social infrastructure like schools and clinics. And figures show that in 2014 we were able to achieve 20% of GDP, which is not good enough. And our gross domestic savings to GDP stand at 16%, which means that we haven't got 30% of our own savings to put into fixed investment, which means we critically have to rely on the savings of foreigners. We have to persuade foreigners that they should put their savings here so that we can try to get up to that rate of fixed investment. We also have a major current account deficit, which was minus 5.4% of GDP in 2014, and we have a major budget deficit, roughly minus 4% of GDP, and our interest bill is around 128 billion a year now, but it's projected, of course, to keep rising because debt is going up so fast, and it could soon rise to 158 billion, which is pretty much what we spend on health, a little bit more than we spend on housing and community amenities. So there's a huge drain on the fiscus every year unless we can generate more growth and generate. And FDI in South Africa in the first quarter of 2015, there was actually a negative outflow. In other words, more went out than came in, minus 22 billion. Portfolio investment was still positive at 39 billion, but portfolio investment, as we all know, is fickle and can easily reverse itself. So South Africa simply cannot afford this bill. We know that the FDI flows turned negative last year, and the situation is worse now. We're no longer one of the top 25 investment destinations in the world. According to the A.T. Kearney report for 2015, we've dropped out of the top 25 altogether. And yet in 2014, we ranked 13th. So it's been a very sharp fall. And they explain it on the basis that there's too much regulatory uncertainty in South Africa, and then diplomatically that other countries seem more interested in reform and have a greater entrepreneurial spirit. And the DTI has really made a number of false claims which are worrying. It says, for example, that the current bill codifies and reflects the standard provisions in bilateral investment treaties, which is simply not true. It talks about these various BITs that have been terminated having just ended through the effluxion of time. And it says that the divergence between the bill and the SADC Protocol doesn't matter because the SADC Protocol is under review, which is also not accurate. There is also a worry that if we adopt the bill in its current form with so little protection for investors, either domestic or foreign, that this, together with the expropriation bill in its current form, could see laws like SIRA and the MPRDA amendments being enacted into law. SIRA, for example, the Private Security Industry Regulation Bill that I talked about before, that requires private security companies to have 51% South African ownership, has already been adopted by Parliament. All it needs is for President Jacob Zuma to sign it, and it becomes law. And it will, of course, bring about an indirect expropriation of companies in South Africa, which include, for example, FedEx, which merely transport security equipment such as cameras, but would also be covered within the provisions of the bill. The MPRDA amendments have also been adopted by Parliament. They're currently on hold. And they are very worrying too, because they give the mining minister the power effectively to expose export and price controls on minerals which are designated as necessary for local beneficiation. And local beneficiation is no doubt something that would be of value to the country. But as the National Development Plan warned, we can't actually do it at the moment because we don't have enough electricity and we don't have the skills. So the NDP cautioned the government against seeing beneficiation as a kind of panacea for our economic ills. The MPRDA amendments ignore that. And if they do indeed impose price and export controls, again, there's an indirect expropriation because though the state doesn't acquire ownership, current owner is deprived of some of the benefits and powers of ownership. So if this happens, it will be further self-inflicted blows on our economy. We are, of course, at the mercy of what happens globally in China and elsewhere, but there are many policy decisions that lie within our own ambit to decide one way or the other. And we, of course, need investment for growth. And just to give some figures here, the cumulative value of FDI in South Africa stands at approximately 1,600 billion rand. And about 85% of that total has come from the West, particularly from the UK, Europe, and the US. The cumulative value of indirect investment, that's mostly purchases of shares or purchases in the bond market, is now 2,700 billion. And of that, about 90% has come from the West. So the West is incredibly important to South Africa in terms of investment from outside. FDI from China at 59 billion rand, and it makes up less than 4% of the total. Investment from Russia at the moment is still so small that it doesn't really feature in the tables drawn up by Statistics South Africa. That might change if they go for the big nuclear build, but it may not be the best measure for South Africa either if they do that. And indirect investment from China, 15 billion rand, or 0.5% of the total. So again, very little. And as I said earlier, given the value of Western investors, it just seems sensible to try and have good relations with everyone Let us be friendly with China and Russia. Let us also retain our traditional ties with the West. These warnings come from AmCham, from the submission that was made to Parliament. The consequences if FDI continues to decrease are too dire to contemplate, that the exchange rate would weaken more. We've seen already how quickly it's gone down. That the outlook for runaway inflation would increase. That the danger of higher interest rates and higher borrowing costs would also go up. And that job losses would be likely to increase too. None of these things are going to do any good to the people of South Africa. We need to avoid them. So I would say the way forward is to emphasize, first of all, that South Africa can't lawfully adopt a bill which is in conflict with the SADC Protocol, which remains binding on us. And it's not enough for the DTI to say that this protocol is being reviewed. The formal changes need to be adopted by 3/4 of SADC members, as I noted before. Or the bill must be redrafted so that it includes all the key SADC provisions. If we're determined to adopt the bill, then that's what we need to do. We could also redraft it to reflect the SA-China BIT, which includes many key provisions, but since we're actually bound by the SADC Protocol, that seems to be the key need to bring the bill into line with that. And if we're not willing to make these changes, then we shouldn't adopt the bill at all. I think the only appropriate stance then for Parliament to take is to say we cannot adopt the bill at this point. If and when the SADC Protocol has been changed, then we can look at it again. Thank you.